Ready? Good morning, and welcome to our third installment of Jewish humor. As I mentioned in the other classes, Jewish humor is not necessarily jokes that are told by Jews. Because as soon as the joke becomes vulgar and it has the wrong objective, it's no longer Jewish. Because Jewish is defined not by what Jews say or do, but what Judaism says. And if the comedian follows the model of Judaism, then it's Jewish humor. If not, then it's not Jewish humor. It may be funny, although I find the people who have to use vulgar language to be very unfunny. The story is told of a rabbi. I believe it's told about the Dubno Maggid. The Dubno Maggid lived about 250 years ago, and he was known for his parables. He was brilliant in finding a parable for every lesson. In fact, someone once asked him, how do you find so many parables? So he said, he was once walking in the forest, and he saw an archer shooting arrows. He didn't see him shooting the arrow, but he just saw the bullseye, and the arrows always hit the bullseye. So he asked the archer, how do you succeed in hitting the bullseye every single time? Because there were a whole bunch of targets, and every one of them had an arrow in the bullseye. So he said, very easily, I shoot the arrow first, then I draw the bullseye, the target around the arrow. And that's what I do as well. I find a lesson and I draw a parable around the lesson. So I think it was this rabbi, known as the Dubno Maggid. Maggid means the preacher. That he would often confront various heretics, people who were rebelling against Judaism, the originally Enlightenment people decided that Judaism is outdated and we have to get rid of all the spiritual parts of it. We have to get rid of the commandments. It's just a culture, and focus on the language, on the culture, on the poetry. And he would often have debates with them, and they would tell him very clearly that they don't believe in Mashiach. They don't believe that there's going to be a time when God will send a human messenger to liberate the Jewish people from exile and bring peace to the world. And they used to challenge him to use some type of a parable to argue with them. So he tells the story of this fox was getting very hungry, and he sees a bird perched on a tree, and the bird looks at the fox, and he realizes that the fox is hungry. Well, the fox is called the sly fox. This must be a trick or something. No, I'm very dead serious. Mashiach is here, and we're no longer going to devour each other. There's going to be universal peace, and all the animals will get along. It'll be paradise on earth. So the bird is becoming a little bit more convinced. Maybe it's true. So he's ready to get off the branch and come down to join with the fox and celebrate the new era. Mashiach has come. And all of a sudden, he hears barking. A whole bunch of dogs are barking, and the fox starts running away. And the bird says, why are you running? He said, the dogs are coming. He says, but you said Mashiach is here, but those dogs don't believe in Mashiach. One of the casualties of living in exile for so long is that sometimes people become very comfortable living in exile. But even with all the anti-Semitism and all the difficulties that Jews experienced in exile, somehow they felt comfortable. And this joke illustrates that point. There was this Jewish couple, an elderly couple, who had a farm. They had cows, they had goats, they had chickens, they had vegetation, they had everything they needed, and they made a decent living. And then one day the husband comes home from shul and he says, the rabbi spoke about Mashiach. And the rabbi said the Mashiach is soon coming. And so the woman, who was not very educated, says to the husband, so what is going to happen? Mashiach is going to take all the Jewish people and bring them to Israel. He says, bring them to Israel? What are we going to do with our farm? What are we going to do with all the cows, with all the goats, with all the chickens, with all the tomatoes and potatoes and onions and beets and all the things that we grow? How are we going to live? So he said, I know it's going to be difficult, but at least the Cossacks won't be attacking us. We'll be able to escape the attacks from the Cossacks. So the wife says, in that case, let the Cossacks go to Israel and we'll stay here. That is a testimony to the ignorance that people had, that they didn't realize what Mashiach is, that nothing will be bad anymore, everything will be good, or it's a utopian. It's very hard for people to get their heads around such a belief. And you get accustomed to living in exile with all the difficulties, and you start to make peace with it. Talking about anti-Semitism, there's a story in the Torah where the sons of Jacob wanted to destroy, and they did destroy the people of Shechem. What happened over there, the Meir of Shechem's son raped their sister Dinah and took her hostage in his house and refused to let her go. He demanded that he should to marry her. And when Shimon and Levi, her brothers, discovered what happened, they wiped out the entire city's male population. But how did they do it? Two people against the whole city. They developed this ruse. This is all in the Bible, all in the Torah. They developed this ruse. We want to intermarry with you. We want to cooperate. We want to do business with you. But we have one condition. You have to all be circumcised. Because if you're not circumcised, we can't join you, because we are all circumcised. And the mayor of Shechem, whose name was Chamor, which means donkey, gathered all the people and says, this is a great business opportunity. We're going to make a lot of money. These people are very enterprising and will marry their daughters. They'll marry our daughters, and we're going to get along, and this will be utopia. This will be great. But they have one condition: to be circumcised. And they all got circumcised, and when they were all, on the third day, when they were really in pain, Shimon and Levi came and wiped out the whole city. So the way the joke is told is, why did they circumcise the people? Why was that such an important thing for them? Of course, the simple answer is because that was the ruse, to get them to become weak so they can attack them without fear of reprisal. But the way the joke goes is, once they're circumcised, they become Jewish. Once they're Jewish, no one will care that you wiped out a whole city, because they're Jews. There was a rabbi whose name was Meir Leibish, known as the Malbim. He wrote a major commentary on the Tanakh, one of the greatest commentators on the Tanakh. He lived about 150 years ago. And he had a lot of problems with the anti-Semites. So once a noted anti-Semite, who was an official, sends him a head of a pig. And the rabbi sends him a picture of himself. So the anti-Semite was curious, why is he sending me a picture of himself? So the rabbi said, you sent me an image of yourself, so I sent you an image of myself. There was another great rabbi. There's a lot of great rabbis who had dealings with anti-Semites. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, he lived about 250 years ago, was known for his wit, one of the greatest scholars, and he would have very often he would have debates and discussions with nobility, with royalty, with priests, and sometimes they would become they would be very nasty. And once he was sitting at a table with a priest. The priest was on the other side of the table, facing him. And at one point in their conversation, the priest says to the rabbi, "What separates a Jew from a pig?" And the rabbi, without any hesitation, says, "This table." On a totally different subject, getting off anti-Semitism for a second, this is a well-known story or joke. This man is standing in front of a huge hotel, beautiful 5-star hotel, and he's smoking a cigar. And a simple Jew goes by and he says to the man, "Why are you smoking that cigar? You know how much cigars cost?" "Yes, I know." He says, "How long have you been smoking?" "Oh, since I was a teenager, I've been smoking cigars. And now I'm a man of like 70, so it's almost 50, over 50 years. He says, "If you would have saved up the money that you spent on cigars, you could have invested, and eventually you could have built a hotel, and you could have sold it and built a few hotels and have a whole chain of hotels. Then you could have built this huge hotel, this beautiful 5-star hotel, with all that money that you spent on cigars." So the man with the cigar says to him, "Do you smoke cigars?" "No." "Do you own a hotel like this?" "Of course not." He says, "Well, that's my hotel." Sometimes we begrudge wealthy people who spend money on luxuries, and if we criticize them because there are more important things in life, that's a legitimate criticism. But sometimes we criticize them by saying, "Look at all the money you have, and you could have used it for many good things." Well, very often those are the people who do both. The people who spend on luxuries are usually the people who give millions, if not billions of dollars to charity. Not always, but you have to be careful before you criticize people who are rich. It's a tendency in society to criticize rich people because it's a form of jealousy. But if not, the Gemara, the Talmud tells us that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the compiler and editor of the Mishnah, one of the greatest rabbis, would give honor to rich people. Why would he give honor to rich people? Not just because they were charitable, but because he realized that to be wealthy was a tremendous challenge. It's a greater challenge than to be poor. Being poor is also a challenge, of course, but being rich is a greater challenge. And if God gives you a challenge, it means he gives you the ability to meet that challenge. So he would honor them as a way of showing them how much potential they have and that they should use that potential. We just went through the holiday of Shavuos, the anniversary of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And very often you hear the criticism from people who decide that the Torah is not for them. "Oh, when was the Torah given? 3,300 plus years ago?" Things have changed. The world has changed. The society has changed. Technology has changed. It's no longer relevant. Well, the story is told of a very wealthy, also we're talking about wealthy people who had to travel with his goods hundreds of miles to the fair somewhere in some city in Europe. And he hires this coach driver, this wagon driver, and he says to him, "I have to go from where I am now to this destination. Could you take me there? I have to get there before April. So you have to take into consideration that there's going to be a lot of snow and the roads are going to be slippery. Could you get me there in time? And I'll pay you handsomely. And he gave him a sum of money that he offered to give him. And the man says, guaranteed, I'll get you there. Sure enough, the conditions were terrible. And he misses the deadline. And the rich man, loses all his profits. He couldn't sell anything because the fair was over. So what do? The man says, but look, I tried hard. It wasn't my fault. It was the weather. And I did everything in my power to get you there in time. It's not my fault. Why should I lose the money for the wagon for driving? And the rich man said, but what did I need you for? I only needed you because I was going to sell my wares and make a profit. And that's my business. That's my livelihood. Why should I pay you when you failed? Well, when two Jews have an argument, they go to the rabbi to be the judge. So the rich man presents his case that he lost this whole business, all the profits, and the coach driver presents his case that he tried hard. So the rabbi says, you have to give me time. I'm going to go to my study and I'm going to look it up and see what the Talmud says about this case. And he comes back and he says to the coach driver, he doesn't owe you anything. Jewish law that says that he made a condition with you. The condition was not kept. Therefore, the fee is not earned by you. You cannot get paid. And the coach driver was very upset. He says, what did you base that on? He says, I based it on the Torah. Tell me, when was the Torah given? Well, it's given in the month of Sivan. What time of the year is that? That's late in spring. He says, if the Torah would have been given in the winter, it would have had a different ruling. Which, of course, is the whole argument that Torah is outdated is ludicrous, because if you believe that Torah was given at Mount Sinai by God, God happens to know the future, and he knows that these laws are eternal. As the Torah itself mentions many times, these are eternal laws. Talking about wagons, I remember once we had a speaker who came to town about 40 years ago, a very well-known speaker. His name was Rabbi Hollander. And he started off his talk by saying there was once a guy who needed a wagon to schlep his wares. So he hires this wagon driver. And the rich guy jumps onto the wagon, he loads all the wagon, and they're about to go. And the wagon driver says, no, you can't sit in the wagon. These horses don't have the strength. We're going uphill. You have to help the horses get out, and we're going to push the wagon up the hill. So the rich man is, he's out of breath, pushing the wagon up the hill. As soon as the wagon comes to the top of the hill, the rich man jumps into the wagon and says, okay, now I could sit here. No, you can't. If you stay in the wagon, the weight will be so heavy, we'll go downhill, we'll just go racing downhill, the whole wagon will turn over and the poor horse will collapse. We have to restrain the wagon as we go downhill. Well, this continues uphill, downhill, until they reach their destination. So the rich guy says to the wagon driver, I have a question to ask you. I understand what I'm doing here. I'm a businessman. I have wares to sell. I understand what you're doing here. You have to make a living, so you rent out a wagon. I know why we need the wagon. That's where I put all the merchandise. But who needs the horse? That was the rabbi's way of saying, why did you bring me to speak? Why did you bring the horse to speak? There are plenty of people here locally in Buffalo who could have done the same job. I reminded myself of that story when we told the story of the wagon driver who missed the deadline. In Russia, there was an underground movement of Chabad Jews who resisted the pressure of the Soviet regime to give up their Judaism. And thousands of young people came out of Russia, being steeped in Judaism, even though it may have cost them their lives, and many of them lost their lives. My Leah's uncle was one of the people murdered by the Soviet regime because he publicly taught Judaism. And he was sent away to the Gulag, and he lasted a few weeks. So this was a common thing. I don't know if the story is true or not, but it's a story that could have happened. And one of the kids was in a public school, and they were teaching history. And the teacher asks the children, you tell me what happened in 1799. And one kid raises his hand, the Chabad kid raises his hand and says, that's when the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneir Zalman, the founder of Chabad, was released from prison. So the teacher got very angry. He said, how dare you bring in religious people? This is the Soviet Union. We don't believe in all that stuff. And what happened in 1799 is that's when Pushkin was born. Pushkin was a famous Soviet writer, a poet. A Russian, okay. Okay, so the kid says, okay, I didn't know that. Then the teacher says, what happened in 1812? So the kid raises his hand, he says, Pushkin's bar mitzvah? What happened in 1812, what she was probably asking for, is that's when Napoleon invaded Russia. And that's when the Alter Rebbe actually passed away, fleeing Napoleon's armies. In the olden days, they didn't have supermarkets where you can go and buy kosher food wrapped up, and you just have to take it home and cook it. When you wanted to have meat, you went to the butcher, and the butcher, where did he get his meat from? He would purchase animals. Now sometimes the animals were examined, the lungs, especially the lungs, and they turned out to be non-kosher. If there's some problem with the lungs or any other internal organ, the animal is not kosher. And the butcher would have suffer a loss, because kosher meat commanded much more, a higher price than non-kosher meat. So what happens when a butcher would take the animal, slaughter it, and discover that the animal had a problem with the lungs, you would bring it to the rabbi. And the rabbi was trained in the internal organs of an animal. That's one of the things that rabbis used to be, and some rabbis even today are trained on to become ordained. They had to know the anatomy of the animal. And depending on what kind of problem, it would determine if the animal was kosher or not. So this Jew, this butcher, would travel a long distance to the rabbi whenever he had a question on his animal. And the rabbi would tell him sometimes the animal was kosher, sometimes it wasn't. And someone told him, why do you have to schlep all the way to the rabbi? There's a better system that you can use yourself. What's the system? In the Torah it says that if you have an animal, if the animal is not kosher, l'kelev tashlichano, so you throw it to the dog. You give it to the dogs. It says it in the Talmud that that was a reward for the dogs for not barking when the Jews were going out of Egypt. So the reward was given that any non-kosher meat goes to the dog. So how does that determine if it's kosher or not? If the dog eats it, that means it's not kosher. If the dog doesn't eat it, then it's kosher. So the man used that system, but then after a few months, he came back to the rabbi. So the rabbi asked him, how come I haven't seen you in such a long time? You used to come with questions very often. So he said, I had this other system. And I would give it to the dogs. If the dogs ate it, it means it wasn't kosher. If the dogs didn't eat it, it meant it was kosher. So he said, why did you come to me now? He says, because the dogs were very strict. This one is a true story. In a certain community in Poland, there was a very wealthy man who was known not only to be a miser, but a very nasty person, not liked by anyone in the community. Not only was he not charitable, contrary to the general attitude of wealthy people and throughout history in the Jewish community, that they were very charitable. He was not charitable. Not only that, he harmed people. He got in people's way. He competed with them. He was just hated by everyone. But he had a desire not only to be in control of everything, he thought that he was entitled to be the cantor for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. But he had a horrible voice to the bargain. But when he approached the Gabayim, the people in charge, and he says, I would like to be the cantor, they couldn't tell him no. Because if they said no, who knows what harm he can cause them. But there's a custom they had that before Rosh Hashanah, whoever was the cantor would have to go to get a blessing from the great Hasidic Rebbe, Rabbi Meir of Primishlan. Rabbi Meir of Primishlan was an exceptional person, very holy man, known for his for many things, but we're not going to go into his history right now. And he would give the cantor a blessing. Why would you want a blessing? That your prayers should be heartfelt, that your prayers should inspire people and plead with God to give us a good year. So you wanted a blessing from a holy man. So they sent him hoping that Rabbi Meir would somehow find a way of convincing him not to be the chazan. What does he do? Rabbi Meir says to him, if you look in the book of Psalms, there are 3 kinds of Psalms that are prefaced by the word tefillah, prayer. There's tefillah l'Moshe, the prayer of Moses. There's tefillah l'David, the prayer of King David. And there's tefillah l'Ani, the prayer of a poor man. Now, Moses' prayer, Moses was not known for a good voice. Moses was known for his piety. So sometimes a person who doesn't have a good voice could be a cantor because he has piety. King David was known especially for his beautiful voice. He was the sweet singer of Israel. So sometimes the cantor, because of his voice, he can inspire people, even if he's not the most holy of people. But then there's the poor man. The poor man may not be very pious, may not be very melodious, doesn't have such a good voice, but he cries out to God from his heart because he's poor and he's suffering. Look, he says to this rich man, he says, what should I do? Should I pray, give you a blessing, you should be like Moses? Let's be realistic, you're no Moses. It's not an insult to say you're no Moses. There's only one Moses. Should I say that pray that you should be like King David? Look, everyone knows you know Caruso. You know, there are people who have better voices than you. The only thing I could pray is that you should become poor. So, would you like me to pray for you to become poor? And the man says, no, I think I'll give up on this job. I'm not going to become the chazan. A very religious Jew was traveling, and he comes to a city, and he wants to get kosher food. So he goes to this butcher shop, and he doesn't know if the man was reliable or not. Nowadays, every kosher butcher has if there are kosher butchers left, and besides supermarkets, has a letter endorsing that this is a kosher location and the meat is kosher. You can rely on it. But in those days, they didn't have it. You had to trust the person, the butcher. And here you're in a strange town. So he goes to this butcher shop and he sees the guy and he says, can you tell me, can I really rely on you that the meat is kosher? He said, I want to show you something. He takes him to a back room and he shows him a picture on the wall of a venerable rabbi with a long white beard. And he says, you see, this is my grandfather. He was a very righteous person. So the man says, I'll tell you what. If your grandfather was in the store and you were hanging on the wall, I would have no problems. But the problem is your grandfather is hanging on the wall and you're walking in the store. I'm not so sure. The story is told of a great rabbi. I heard this story told about different people, so I'm not sure who it was told. Maybe it's not even true. But it was customary, it still is customary, when you publish a book on any topic of Judaism, you get an endorsement, or endorsements plural, from different rabbis who review the book and tell you that the book is brilliant and the author is brilliant and this is a phenomenal work and this is what helps the book sell. So this author comes to this rabbi, this great rabbi, and apparently the author could tell by the way the rabbi could tell by the way the author was speaking that he's far from being a scholar. But he had to look through the book, so he opens up the book to the front where it was blank pages. And the rabbi looks at the blank page and says, "Wow, incredible." And the author is looking at the rabbi. There was nothing on the page. It was the cover of the page, the back of the cover. Then he opens up the book to the text and he looks at it and he says, "Wow, incredible." So the man thinks, well, at least he's impressed with my writing. He says, "Can you tell me what you were so impressed with when you opened the book to the blank page?" He says, "I looked at a blank page and I saw paper and I realized that this used to be pulp. And it was transformed into paper. And then when you read my text, why were you so impressed? Because I saw you took beautiful paper and turned it back into pulp." Okay, next one needs some background. This is again, it's told as a true story of Rabbi Meir Shapiro. Rabbi Meir Shapiro was a leading Polish rabbi before the war. He was a member of the Polish parliament. And he's known for especially two things. One was he established a yeshiva with a dormitory in Lublin. And it was the most incredible yeshiva. To get in, you had to know a few hundred pages of Talmud by heart. I had a teacher who was a graduate of that, and he knew the whole Talmud by heart. But this is one of his accomplishments. The other accomplishment is that he instituted studying a page of Talmud a day. So in the course of 7.5 years, you study the whole Talmud. Anyhow, he was also a member of a Jewish religious party called Aguda, which is now a political party in Israel. And he was a member of the parliament, together with another famous Polish rabbi who was later on murdered by the Nazis. At any rate, Rabbi Meir Shapiro was very much involved in fundraising for his yeshiva. And he came to America. And he didn't have very much success. That's what they say. He didn't have that much success. And he came to a wealthy man's house, and the man was very nasty to him and wouldn't give him a penny. So Rabbi Meir Shapiro says to him, "What do you think, I'm a pregnant woman?" And the rich man looks at him and says, "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" Well, this needs a lot of background. Before Yom Kippur, there's a custom, what's called shlug kaparas. You heard of it? Kaparas? The word kapara means atonement. And one of the ways we procure atonement is we take a chicken and we swing it around our heads and we say this should be, and later on the chicken is slaughtered and the meat is given to the poor. And it's called kaparas because it's atonement. Now you only need one chicken per person. But if you're pregnant, since you have another person in you, you do two. Okay, so he explained as follows. Whenever I come to a rich person to ask him for money for charity, and he gives me a lot of honor, he's very nice and very, very polite, and I say, I didn't get money, a kapara de geld. Let the loss of money be an atonement. That's a Yiddish expression. When something doesn't go right, you say, let it be a kapara. Let it be an atonement. Sometimes I come to a rich person, he's not very nice to me, but he gives me a nice check. I say, a kapara de kavod. Let the lack of honor be an atonement for me. But you didn't give me a penny, and you didn't give me any honor. 2 kaparas. Only a pregnant woman needs 2. So you have to have a little background to understand these jokes. This is an old one. You know what a shadchan is? What? A matchmaker. A matchmaker. It was said that the word shadchan is an acronym for 4 words. Sheker, dover, kesef, notel. Which means sheker, falsehood, dover, he speaks, kesef, money, notel, he takes. Because sometimes the matchmaker has to exaggerate a little here, a little there. So the story is told that this matchmaker comes to a poor man, and he says to him, "I'd like to make a match for your daughter." He says, "My daughter is not ready for getting married. You know, she still has time. We're not interested. So, but if I tell you that she's going to get married to Rothschild's son, would you consider it?" Rothschild's son? Absolutely. Then he goes to Rothschild, and he says, "Would you like to have a match for your son?" So he says, "My son, I'm not ready." So, but if I tell you it's going to be to the daughter, I got it the wrong way. It's the daughter to the son. It's the other way around. That it's going to be to the vice president of the World Bank, or whatever huge bank there was in those days. Would you marry your daughter to that person? And he says, to the vice president of the World Bank, absolutely. Then he goes to the bank, and he goes to the president of the bank, and he says, would you want to hire someone as a vice president? He says, I have too many vice presidents already. He says, but this vice president is Rothschild's son-in-law. He says, sure, absolutely. And he made the shidduch, he made the match. A young man was going out on his first date, and his father gives him some pointers. And he says, when you go out on a date, since he was inexperienced, he didn't know what to talk about, there are 3 things you talk about. You talk about family. You find out about each other's family. You talk about love, romance, love. And then you talk some philosophy. I guess the person has to know that you have a head, that you think, that you're serious. So the guy goes out on this date and he sees the girl for the first time. This is the first time he meets a girl. And he says to her, he has to talk family. He says, do you have a brother? And she says, no. Why do you ask? But he ignores her and he says, he has to talk about love. Do you love noodles? And she says, no. Why are you asking? Now it's philosophy. He said, if you had a brother, would he have loved noodles? In Jewish life, those are the 3 things that we always focus on. There has to be some connection. The family is very important in Judaism. And love is, of course, very important. But also the philosophy of life. What keeps a marriage together is when both sides have the same philosophy. People often ask, how come in Orthodox and Hasidic couples, they date a few times, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, go out to take a few months or even a few weeks, and they're engaged and they're married, and the statistics of divorce is much lower than it is in general society. How does it work? And the answer is, before they even meet, before they even know of each other's existence, they were already 80-90% compatible. Why? Because they grew up with the same philosophy, with the same belief system, with the same approach to life, the same idealism, the same of everything. So they just have to figure out if the other 10 or 20% is compatible. So that, how many times do you have to go out to figure that out? Teacher of the Hebrew school was asking the kids, wanted to know what goes on in the home, if there's anything relating to God, to Judaism in a home. So one kid says, yes, we have a prayer book. Another one says, we have a Bible. And the third one says, we have a scale, a bathroom scale. He says, a bathroom scale? What does that have to do with religion? He says, every time my mother gets on the scale, she says, oh my God! The truth of that is that God is connected to everything. Maybe not the way that the person cries out to him on the scale. We have a lot of chutzpah as a nation. The Talmud says that the most audacious people, people with the most hubris and chutzpah, we all know what chutzpah means, are the Jewish people. And the story is told of this grandmother is going with her grandson to the beach, and all of a sudden this huge wave comes and sweeps him away. And she cries out to God, "God, please save my grandson." And a few seconds later, a wave comes back and he lands right in front of her. And he's sound and healthy and nothing, no harm. And she turns heavenward, she says, "God, he was wearing a hat." But you know what? When you ask God for something, even something frivolous, you know what that proves? That proves that you really believe in God. Why would you be asking God for something that's so insignificant? Because God can do everything. So he doesn't just have to save the life of the child, he can even give the hat. And that's the basis of prayer. The basis of prayer is the most profound way of saying that I really have strong belief in God, because I'm asking him for something. You don't ask something that doesn't exist for something, and something that you don't even know if it exists. You have to know that it exists to ask for something. And sometimes we ask for foolish things, but nevertheless, it's a very powerful expression of our faith. In Judaism, much respect was accorded to rabbis, even though we make fun of rabbis, but it's all in good-natured, but also doctors. In the Talmud, we have some of the Talmudic rabbis, not many, but some of them were doctors. And the more critical the Talmud is of doctors, that's the proof that they held them in high regard, because the Talmud is also critical of rabbis. The Talmud says about rabbis. Rabbis in those days were judges, and even to this day, rabbis are judges of Jewish law. So the Talmud talks about how a rabbi, a judge, has to imagine that when someone comes with a question, that he's right in front of the entrance to Gehenna, or a sharp sword is ready to slice him if he makes a mistake. In other words, the rabbis are the closest to hell that you can get, because they have such responsibility. And it says the same thing about doctors. They deserve to go to hell, which means it's a criticism, self-criticism, because the rabbis who wrote this were themselves doctors. And then throughout the Middle Ages, most of the greatest rabbis in Sephardic countries mostly were doctors. Maimonides was the most famous, of course. So this translated also in modern times, even in the secular Jewish community. They tell the story of this mother is wheeling her two children and the stroller, and someone comes over and says, oh, well, it's very nice you have these two children. He says that, yeah, this one is the doctor, this one is the lawyer. In the year 2032, the first woman is elected president of the United States, Mrs. Goldfarb. Happens to be Jewish also. And now the inauguration day arrives, and she says to her mother, I want you to be there. She says, oh, it's a big schlep. She says, I'll get you a special private jet, and you'll be taken care of, don't worry about it. So the mother comes, and she's sitting on the dais, and she turns to the senator, and she says, you see that woman over there? The one who's being sworn in as president? Her brother is a doctor. Two members of the Shalom community come to America, and they're watching the 11 o'clock news. And it's a story of someone standing on the top of the skyscraper and ready to jump off. And they shut the radio for a second, or the television, And one of them says to the other, I'll bet you $10 that he's going to jump. And the other one says, no, I'll bet you $10 that he's not going to jump. They turn it back on, and sure enough, he jumps. So the guy says, okay, I owe you $10. He says, no, you don't. I listened to the 10 o'clock news, and they had the report, and he jumped. So it's not fair that I should collect the $10 because I knew already. And the other one says, I also watched the 10 o'clock news, and I thought, he's not going to do it again. Now, there's a joke that was told, the Rabbi once told this, that when we learned the Torah about Joseph, Joseph is sold by his brothers. And when a child was learning this in school, I don't know if it was Chelm or some other place, the child was really heartbroken, was so pained by this. How could you sell your brother? And Joseph was subjected to such harm and such pain, and it really bothered this child. The child was a very sensitive child. Next year, the cycle of the Torah comes back again to where it was before. And again, the teacher teaches the story that Joseph is sold by his brothers, and the kid doesn't get upset. He doesn't react the way he did a year before. So the teacher says, I don't understand. You were so sensitive. You reacted so strongly before last year. Why today you take it in stride? He says, last year was the first time it happened. If Joseph repeated, he went to see his brothers, now it's his own fault. I don't have to pity him. Jewish guy comes to the doctor. This is about the patient now. He had terrible pain. He had sciatica, and the pain was unbearable. But before him, there was another patient who also had the same problem, and the guy was screaming and howling every time the doctor touched his leg. And the Jewish guy is treated next, and the doctor is touching his leg and manipulating it and doing everything, and he's silent. And the guy says to him, the non-Jew says to him, I never saw someone who was so stoic. How could you endure such pain without peeps, without a sound? He says, what pain? I showed the doctor the wrong foot. Sometimes people, the same thing happens with rabbis. Sometimes people come to the rabbi and they tell them about certain issues, and they don't tell them the truth, because they know the truth is going to get a negative reaction. So they tell them, they make up a baba maisa. You know what a baba maisa is? A grandmother's tale. Adam was very lonely, and God says to him, I'm going to give you a partner. And what will she be like? She's going to be wonderful. She's going to be loving and caring. Everything you want, she will give you. She never complain about anything. And he went on, extolling the virtue of this partner. And what do I have to pay for that? An arm and a leg. What do you have for a rib? But this is a bad joke, because the truth of the matter is that if you read the creation story accurately, Adam was defective when God took a side or a rib of Adam to create Eve. And that's why it says in the Talmud, that's why it's customary that the man looks for the wife. I know nowadays culturally things have changed, but that was the way it was traditionally. Why does the man look for the wife? So the Talmud says, when you lose something, who searches for whom? Does the lost object search for the owner, or does the owner search for the lost object? In other words, without marriage, the man is defective. The woman was created independent. She needs marriage for other reasons, but she's not defective. Her humanity is not, she's created. That's why many women in the morning blessing, they say, God, thank you that you made me kirtsono, as you wanted. I am perfect, I don't have to be perfected. The masculine energy has to be perfected. The feminine energy has to be elevated and cherished and nurtured, but not it doesn't have to be replaced with anything. She's not missing anything. And again, this joke points out the opposite of what they had this couple, 50th anniversary, and they asked the husband, what were these 50 years like? He says, they were like 2 days. Which 2 days? Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. Really, he should answer Purim and Simchas Torah. That's the real answer. A bunch of construction workers were working, and they come for lunch, and one of them takes out some gourmet food, another one takes out some delicacy, and the third one takes out a tuna sandwich. And you can see he's grimacing while he's eating the tuna sandwich. And this happens the next day and the day after and the day after. After a few weeks, the same thing repeated. Every day it's a tuna sandwich. The guy says, if I get tuna tomorrow, I'm going to throw myself off this high building. And the next day he opens up his sandwich, and lo and behold, it's a tuna sandwich. So the people say to him, why don't you ask your wife to pack something else instead of tuna? He says, what do you mean, my wife? I do it myself. And there's a lot of truth to this, that sometimes we create our own problems. I don't know what this joke is supposed to illustrate, just about maybe criticism of lawyers. But this lawyer gets into an accident, and his whole side of his brand new sports car is damaged. And the lawyer gets out of the car, and the policeman comes, and the lawyer is complaining about what happened to his car. And the police says, look, your left arm has been severed. You don't have a left arm. And he says, I had a Rolex on it. It's about how some people are so into the luxuries, they forget about what's important. Okay, this one is not a nice one. $50 is $50. The couple goes to Niagara Falls. They want to go on a ride in a helicopter. The wife says, please, could we take this helicopter ride? And the husband says, no, it's too expensive. It's $50. $50 is $50. So they don't go on the ride. Finally, the one who was in charge of the helicopter, the pilot, overhears them arguing about going on the helicopter ride. And he hears that they're arguing about $50. He says, I'll tell you what, I'll take you on for free on one condition, that you don't complain about anything. You just are silent the whole time. I can't take people getting scared when you're in the helicopter and making my life miserable. So if you speak, you owe me $50. But if you're silent, you don't owe me anything. So they both agree, and now it's for free. And this helicopter ride was harrowing, was terrible. The guy was making all sorts of maneuvers but not a single word. And then the helicopter pilot said, I was so impressed, I was convinced that you were going to shout, that you were going to scream. And the guy says, look, I was about to scream when my wife fell out, but $50 is $50. I think these jokes are there to make fun of people who value their money more than their life. You know, the famous Hasidic Yankel Benny, Jack Benny. Jack Benny was accosted by a burglar, and he said, give me your money or your life. And he hesitated, and the thief says to him, well, he says, I'm thinking. Now that's actually taken from the Talmud. I don't know if Jack Benny knew about it, but the Talmud says on the Shema, when we read the Shema, there are two paragraphs that are very similar, but there are some differences. In the first paragraph, it says, love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. In the second paragraph, it only has your heart and your soul, no with all your might. So the Talmud explains, what does all your might mean? If you gave your life to God, what more could you give? So the Talmud says there are some people for whom their money is more important than their lives. even that person should love God with all his money. Love God with your life and even with your money. But that's only in the first section. Why not in the second section? So commentaries say the second section is addressed to the whole community. That's not a communal issue. There are certain individuals, there are certain Jack Bennies for whom their money is more important than their life. They'll risk their lives to save a few dollars. So that's a state of mind where money becomes more valuable than life, but these jokes are there to mock. This next one is one of my favorite. I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I think it has a very powerful message. This 18-wheeler is speeding down the highway, and he comes to an overpass, and the clearance was not there, and he gets stuck in the overpass. I never knew it was an overpass or an underpass. What? Well, you're traveling in the underpass, but it's an overpass. But that's irrelevant to the joke. Anyhow, he's stuck, and now the traffic is held up for miles and miles. A state trooper comes racing down the other side of the highway, stops at the truck, and he says to the driver, you got stuck here. And the guy says, no, I didn't get stuck. I was delivering a bridge, and I got out of gas. I ran out of gas. Why do I think it's such a good joke? I heard more funny jokes than that, but I think it has a very powerful message. There are two ways of dealing with an obstacle. One way is recognizing it's an obstacle and you have to deal with it, find ways of maneuvering, getting around it, and you're frustrated. And the other way of looking at it, that every obstacle is not an obstacle. It's a challenge. God is giving you something and he wants you to deliver it into the realm of holiness. Everything in this world exists in either the realm of holiness or the realm of unholiness. And if something is neutral, you can go either way. So God says, take it and bring it into the realm of holiness. Don't look at it as an obstacle. Don't look at it as a detour. It's not a detour. You're delivering something for God. Sometimes you run out of gas. Yes, that happens. So put some more gas in, but it's not a fundamental, it's not an existential threat to you. I don't know if I told this one in the past. I can't remember all the jokes that I told, even in these few classes. But I think I told this one. I'll tell it again. If you don't laugh, I'll know I told it again. This guy comes to the bar and orders a beer, and he takes the beer and he throws it at the bartender. And the bartender says, "What was that all about?" He says, "Oh, I have this terrible problem. I don't know what I'm going to do about it. I just lose my senses and I throw things at people. But I won't do it again." A week later, he comes into the bar, orders a beer, and throws it at the bartender. He says, "I thought you said you're not going to do it again." "Yes, I promise you I won't do it again." A week later, he comes in, and the same thing happens. And the bartender says, "Okay, that's it. You can't come to this bar until you get real, solid psychological counseling. You have a serious problem. You need counseling." And the man says, "Yes, you're right. I'm going to take care of that." A year later, he comes back in with a big smile on his face, and the bartender says, "Did you have counseling?" "Yes, I went through counseling." And he orders a beer and he throws it at the bartender. The bartender says, "I thought you said you had counseling." He says, "Yes, doesn't bother me anymore." That's a little bit of a critique of the psychological community. And finally, the one about modesty. This man realizes that when he dies, people are going to say eulogies about him, but he won't be able to hear it. So he decided, I'm going to feign death. I'm going to give out the rumors that I died. They'll take me to the funeral parlor, and then we're going to have all these people delivering these eulogies. So at least I'll enjoy hearing the nice things they're going to say about me. And sure enough, this eloquent speaker gets up and talks about how this man was brilliant, and he was kind, and he was compassionate, he was charitable, he was sweet, he was warm. And he went on and on and on, and he's winding down, about to finish his long eulogy. And all of a sudden, there's a squeaking sound. The cover of the coffin raises up and he sticks his head out, and what about my modesty? So what about our modesty? Any questions? So we have one more. So this was a little bit of a, trying to do Jewish humor with Jewish content, not just something funny. Sometimes something funny is needed to cheer us up, to get us out of our doldrums, but sometimes you want to have something that has some inner content to it. And I hope that this is what we've accomplished. Okay. Thank you.